Lovers of the Lake by Seán Faoláin. She had said, as she stood sipping her tea and looking down at the suburban tennis players in the square, and then, turning her head in that swift movement that always reminded him of a jackdaw, "By the way, Bobby, will you drive me up to Loch Derrig next week?" He replied amiably from the lazy deeps of the armchair, "Certainly. What part? Killaloe? But is there a good hotel there?" "I mean the other Loch Derrig. I want to do the pilgrimage." For a second he looked at her in surprise and then burst into laughter. Then he looked at her peeringly. "Jenny, are you serious?" "Of course." "Do you mean that place with the island where they go round on their bare feet on sharp stones and starve for days and sit up all night, all a-groaning and all a-goning?" He got out of the chair, went over to the cigarette box on the bookshelves, and with his back to her said coldly, "Are you going religious on me?" She walked over to him swiftly, turned him about, smiled her smile that was whiter than the whites of her eyes, and lowered her head appealingly on one side. When this produced no effect, she said, "Bobby, I'm always praising you to my friends as a man who takes things as they come. So few men do, never looking beyond the day, doing things on the spur of the moment. It's why I like you so much. Other men are always weighing up and considering and arguing." "Are you going to let me down now?" After a while, he'd looked at his watch and said, "All right then. I'll try and fix up a few days free next week. I must drop into the hospital now. But I warn you, Jenny, I've noticed this Holy Joe streak in you before. You'll do it once too often." She patted his cheek, kissed him sedately, said, "You're a good boy," and saw him out with a loving smile. They enjoyed that swift morning drive to the Shannon's shore. He suspected nothing when she refused to join him in a drink at Carrick. Leaning over the counter, they joked with the barmaid like any husband and wife off on a motoring holiday. As they rolled smoothly round the northern shore of Loch Gill, he'd suddenly felt so happy that he'd stroked her purple glove and winked at her. The loch was vacant under the midday sun, its vast expanse of stillness broken only by a jumping fish or by its eyelash fringe of reeds. He didn't suspect anything when she sent him off to lunch by himself in Sligo, saying that she had to visit an old nun she knew in the convent. So far, the journey had been to him no more than one of her caprices, until a yellow signpost marked "To Bundoran" made them aware that her destination and their parting was near, for she said, "What are you proposing to do until Wednesday?" "I hadn't given it a thought." "Don't go off and forget all about me, darling. You know you're to pick me up on Wednesday, about midday." After a silence, he grumbled, "You're making me feel a hell of a bastard, Jenny. Why on earth? All this penitential stuff's because of me, isn't it? Don't be silly. It's just something I thought up all by myself out of my own clever little head." He drove on for several miles without speaking. She looked sideways with amusement at his ruddy, healthy hockey player face glimmering under the peak of his checked cap. The brushes at his temples were getting white. Everything about him bespoke the distinguished Dublin surgeon on holiday. His pale green shirt, his darker green tie, his double-breasted waistcoat, his driving gloves with the palms made of woven cord. She looked pensively towards the sea. He growled, "I may as well tell you this much, Jenny. If you were my wife, I wouldn't stand for any of this nonsense." So their minds had travelled to the same thought. But if she were his wife, the question would never have arisen. She knew by the sudden rise of speed that he was in one of his tempers, so that when he pulled into the grass verge, switched off and turned towards her, she was not taken by surprise. A seagull moaned high overhead. She lifted her grey eyes to his and smiled, waiting for the attack. "Jenny, would you mind telling me exactly what all this is about? I mean, why are you doing all this foul-lal at this particular time?" "I always wanted to do this pilgrimage, so it naturally follows that I would do it sometime, doesn't it?" "Perhaps. But why, for instance, this month and not last month? The island wasn't open to pilgrims last month. Why didn't you go last year instead of this year? You know we went to Austria last year. Why not the year before last?" "I don't know, and stop bullying me. It's just a thing that everybody wants to do sometime. It's a special sort of Irish thing, like Lourdes or Fatima or Lisieux. Everybody who knows about it feels drawn to it. If you were a practicing Catholic, you'd understand. I understand quite well, he snapped. I know perfectly well that people go on pilgrimages all over the world. Spain, France, Mexico. I shouldn't be surprised if they go on them in Russia. What I'm asking you is what has cropped up to produce this extra special performance just now? And I tell you, I don't know. The impulse came over me suddenly last Sunday, looking at those boys and girls playing tennis. For no reason. It just came. I said to myself, all right, go now. I felt that if I didn't do it on impulse, I'd never do it at all. Are you asking me for a rational explanation? I haven't got one. I'm not clever and intelligent like you, darling. You're as clever as a bag of cats. She laughed at him. I do love you, Bobby, when you're cross. Like a small boy. Why didn't you ask George to drive you? She sat up straight. I don't want my husband to know anything whatever about this. Please don't mention a word of it to him. He grinned at his small victory, considered the side of her jawbone, looked at the shining darkness of her hair, and restarted the car. All the same, he said after a mile, there must be some reason, or call it a cause if you don't like the word reason, and I'd give a lot to know what it is. After another mile, of course, I might as well be talking to that old dolman over there as to be asking a woman why she does anything, and if she knew, she wouldn't tell you. After another mile, mind you, I believe all this is just a symptom of something else. Never forget, my girl, that I'm a doctor. I'm trained to interpret symptoms. If a woman comes to me with a pain, oh yes, if a woman comes to Surgeon Robert James Flannery with a pain, he says to her, never mind, that's only a pain. My God, if a woman has a pain, she has a bloody pain, he said quietly. Have you pain? Oh, do shut up. The only pain I have is in my tummy. I'm ravenous. I'm sorry, didn't they give you a good lunch at the convent? I took no lunch. You have to arrive at the island fasting. That's the rule. Do you mean to say you've had nothing at all to eat since breakfast? I had no breakfast. What will you get to eat when you arrive on the island? Nothing, or next to nothing. Everybody has to fast on the island the whole time. Sometime before night I might get a cup of black tea or hot water with pepper and salt in it. I believe it's one of their light-hearted jokes to call it soup. Their speed shot up at once to 65. He drove through Bundoran's siesta hour like the chariot of the apocalypse. Nearing Ballyshannon, they slowed down to a pleasant humming 50. Jenny. Yes? Are you tired of me? Is this more of you and your symptoms? He stopped the car again. Please answer my question. She laid her purple-gloved hand on his clenched fists. Look, darling, we've known one another for 6 years. You know that like any good little Catholic girl, I go to my duties every Easter and every Christmas. Once or twice I've told you so. You've growled and grumbled a bit, but you never made any fuss about it. Why are you suddenly worrying about now? Because all that was just routine, like the French or the Italians. Good Lord, I'm not bigoted. There's no harm in going to church now and again. I do it myself on state occasions, or if I'm staying in some house where they'd be upset if I didn't. But this sort of lunacy isn't routine. She slewed her head swiftly away from his angry eyes. A child in a pink pinafore with shoulder frills was driving 2 black cows through a gap. It was never routine. It's the one thing I have to hang on to in an otherwise meaningless existence. No children, a husband I'm not in love with. And I can't marry you. She slewed back to him. He slewed away to look up the long empty road before them. He slewed back. He made as if to speak. He slewed away impatiently again. No, she interpreted. It isn't any use, is it? It's my problem, not yours. Or if it is yours, you've solved it long ago by saying it's all a lot of damned nonsense. And how have you solved it? He asked sardonically. Have you any cause to complain of how I've solved it? Oh, I'm not defending myself. I'm a fraud. I'm a crook. I admit it. You're more honest than I am. You don't believe in anything. But it's the truth that all I have is you and what? It sounds so blasphemous I can't say it. Say it. All I have is you and God. He took out his cigarette case and took one. She took one. When he lit hers, their eyes met. He said very softly, looking up the empty road, Poor Jenny. I wish you'd talked like this to me before. It is, after all, as you say, your own affair. But what I can't get over is that this thing you're doing is so utterly extravagant. To go off to an island in the middle of a lake, in the mountains, with a lot of craw-thumpers of every age and sex, and no sex, and peel off your stockings and your shoes and go limping about on your bare feet on a lot of sharp stones, and kneel in the mud, psalming and beating your breast like a criminal, and drink nothing for 3 days but salt water. It's not like you. It's a side of you I've never known before. The only possible explanation for it must be that something is happening inside you that I've never seen happen before. She spread her hands in despair. He chucked away his cigarette and restarted the car. They drove on in silence. A mist began to speckle the windscreen. They turned off the main road into sunless hills all brown as hay. The next time he glanced at her, she was making up her face, her mouth rolling the lipstick into her lips, her eyes rolling around the mirror. He said, "You can have a nice picnic if the weather breaks." She glanced out apprehensively. "It won't be fun." A sudden flog of rain lashed into the windscreen. The sky had turned its bucket upside down. He said, "Even if it's raining, do you still have to keep walking around on those damn stones?" "Yes." "You'll get double pneumonia." "Don't worry, darling, it's called St. Patrick's Purgatory. He'll look after me." That remark started a squabble that lasted until they drew up beside the lake. Other cars stood about like stranded boats. Other pilgrims stood by the boat slip waiting for the ferry, their backs hunched to the wind, their clothes ruffled like the fur of cattle. She looked out across the loch at the creeping worms of foam. He looked about him sullenly at the waiting pilgrims, a green bus, 2 taxi loads of people waiting for the rain to stop. They were not his kind of people at all, and he said so. "That," she smiled, "is what comes of being a surgeon. You don't meet people, you meet organs. Didn't you tell me once that when you're operating you never look at the patient's face?" He grunted. Confused and hairy-looking clouds combed themselves on the ridges of the hills. The lake was crumpled and grey except for those yellow worms of foam blown across it in parallel lines. To the south, a cold patch of light made it all look far more dreary. She stared out towards the island and said, "It's not at all like what I expected." "And what the hell did you expect? Capri?" "I thought of an old island with old grey ruins and old holly trees and rhododendrons down to the water, a place where old monks would live." They saw tall buildings like modern hotels rising by the island's shore, an octagonal basilica big enough for a city, 4 or 5 bare slated houses, a long shed like a ballroom. There was 1 tree. Another bus drew up beside them and people peered out through the wiped glass. "Oh, God," she groaned, "I hope this isn't going to be like Lourdes." "And what, pray, is wrong with Lourdes when it's at home?" "Commercialized. I simply can't believe that this island was the most famous pilgrimage of the Middle Ages, on the rim of the known world. It must have been like going off to Jerusalem or coming home brown from the sun with a cockle in your hat from Galilee." He put on a vulgar Yukon voice. "There's gold somewhere in them thar hills." "It looks to me like a damn good financial proposition for somebody." She glared at him. The downpour had slackened. Soon it almost ceased. Gurgles of streams, a sound of pervasive drip. From the back seat she took a small red canvas bag marked TWA. "You will collect me on Wednesday about noon, won't you?" He looked at her grimly. She looked every one of her 41 years. The skin of her neck was corrugated. In 5 years' time she would begin to have jowls. "Have a good time," he said, and slammed in the gears and drove away. The big lumbering ferryboat was approaching, its prow slapping the corrugated waves. There were 3 men to each oar. It began to spit rain again. With about 150 men and women of every age and, so far as she could see, of every class, she clambered aboard. They pushed out and slowly they made the crossing, huddling together from the wind and rain. The boat nosed into its cleft and unloaded. She had a sensation of dark water, wet cement, houses, and a great number of people, and that she would have given gold for a cup of hot tea. Beyond the 4 or 5 whitewashed houses, she guessed that they had been the only buildings on the island before trains and buses made the pilgrimage popular, and beyond the cement paths, she came on the remains of the natural island, a knoll, some warm grass, the tree, and the roots of the old hermit's cells across whose teeth of stone bare-footed pilgrims were already treading on one another's heels. Most of these barefooted people wore macintoshes. They not only stumbled on one another's heels, they kneeled on one another's toes and tails, for the island was crowded. She thought there must be nearly 2,000 people on it. They were packed between the 2 modern hostels and the big church. She saw a priest in a sou'wester and gumboots. A nun waiting for the new arrivals at the door of the women's hostel took her name and address and gave her the number of her cubicle. She went upstairs to it, laid her red bag on the cot, sat beside it, unfastened her garters, took off her shoes, unpeeled her nylons, and without transition became yet another anonymous pilgrim. As she went out among the pilgrims already praying in the rain, she felt only a sense of shame, as if she were specially singled out under the microscope of the sky. The wet ground was cold. A fat old woman in black, rich-breasted, grey-haired, took her kindly by the arm and said in a warm Kerry voice, "You're shivering, you poor creature. Hold hard now. Sure, when we have the first station done, they'll be giving us the old cup of black tea," and laughed at the folly of this longing for the tea. She winced when she stepped onto the gritty concrete of the terrace surrounding the basilica, built out on piles over the lake. A young man smiled sympathetically, seeing that she was a delicate subject for the rigours before her. He was dressed like a clerk, with 3 pens in his breast pocket, and he wore a total abstinence badge. "Saints' Island, they call it," he smiled. "Some people think it should be called Devil's Island." She disliked his kindness. She had never in her life asked for pity from anybody, but she soon found that the island floated on kindness. Everything and everybody about her seemed to say, "We're all sinners here, wretched creatures barely worthy of mercy." She felt the abasement of the doomed. She was among people who had surrendered all personal identity, all pride. It was like being in a concentration camp. The fat old Kerry woman was explaining to her what the routine was, and as she listened, she realized how long her stay would really be. In prospect, it had seemed so short. Come on Monday afternoon, leave on Wednesday at noon. It had seemed no more than 1 complete day and 2 bits of nights. She had not foreseen that immediately after arriving she must remain out of doors until the darkness fell, walking the rounds of the stones, praying, kneeling for about 5 hours. And even then she would get no respite, for she must stay awake all night praying in the basilica. It was then that she would begin the 2nd long day, as long and slow as the night. And on the 3rd day she would still be walking those rounds until midday. She would be without food, even when she would have left the island, until the midnight of that 3rd day. "Yerra, but sure," the old woman cackled happily, "they say that fasting is good for the stomach." She began to think of they. They had thought all this up. They had seen how much could be done with simple prayers. For when she began to tot up the number of paternosters and aves that she must say, she had to stop at the 2000th. And these reiterated prayers must be said while walking on the stones, or kneeling in the mud, or standing upright with her 2 arms extended. This was the posture she disliked most. Every time she came to do it, her face to the lake, her arms spread, the queue listening to her renouncing her sins, she had to force herself to the posture and the words. The first time she did it, with the mist blowing into her eyes, her arms out like a crucifix, her lips said the words, but her heart cursed herself for coming so unprepared, for coming at all. Before she had completed her first circuit, 4 times around each one of 6 cells, 1 ankle and 1 toe were bleeding. She was then permitted to ask for the cup of black tea. She received it sullenly, as a prisoner might receive his bread and water. She wished after that first circuit to start again and complete a second, the 6 cells and the 7 other ordeals at other points of the island, and so be done for the day. But she found that they had invented something else. She must merge with the whole anonymous mass of pilgrims for mass prayer in the church. A slur of wet feet, patter of rain on leaded windows, smells of bog water and damp clothing, the 1,000 voices responding to the incantations. At her right, a young girl of about 17 was uttering heartfelt responses. On her left, an old man in his 60s gave them out loudly. On all sides, before her, behind her, the same passionate exchange of energy, while all she felt was a crust hardening about her heart, and she thought in despair, "I have no more feeling than a stone." And she thought, looking about her, that tonight this vigil would go on for hour after hour until the dark leaded windows coloured again in the morning light. She leaned her face in her palms and whispered, "Oh God, please let me out of myself." The waves of voices beat and rumbled in her ears as in an empty shell. She was carried out on the general sliding whispering of the bare feet into the last gleamings of the daylight to begin her second circuit. In the porch, she cowered back from the rain. It was settling into a filthy night. She was thrust forward by the crowd, flowed with its force to the iron cross by the shingle's edge. She took her place in the queue, and then with the night wind pasting her hair across her face, she raised her arms, and once again renounced the world, the flesh, and the devil. She did 4 circles of the church on the gritty concrete. She circled the first cell's stones. She completed the second circle. Her prayers were become numb by now. She stumbled, muttering them, up and down on the 3rd steeply sloped cell, or bed. She was a drowned cat and one knee was bleeding. At the 4th cell, she saw him. He was standing about 6 yards away, looking at her. He wore a white raincoat buttoned tight about his throat. His feet were bare. His hair was streaked down his forehead as if he had been swimming. She stumbled towards him and dragged him by the arm down to the edge of the boat slip. "What are you doing here?" she cried furiously. "Why did you follow me?" He looked down at her calmly. "Why shouldn't I be here?" "Because you don't believe in it. You've just followed me to sneer at me, to mock at me, or from sheer vulgar curiosity." "No," he said, without raising his voice. "I've come to see just what it is that you believe in. I want to know all about you. I want to know why you came here. I don't want you to do anything or have anything that I can't do or can't know, and as for believing, we all believe in something." Dusk was closing in on the island and the lake. She had to peer into his face to catch his expression. "But I've known you for years and you've never shown any sign of believing in anything but microscopes and microbes and symptoms. It's absurd. You couldn't be serious about anything like this. I'm beginning to hate you." "Are you?" he said so softly that she had to lean near him to hear him over the slapping of the waves against the boat slip. A slow rift in the clouds let down a star. By its light, she saw his smile. "Yes," she cried, so loudly that he swept out a hand and gripped her by the arm. Then he took her other arm and said gently, "I don't think you should have come here, Jenny. You're only tearing yourself to bits. There are some places where some people should never go, things some people should never try to do, however good they may be for others. I know why you came here. You feel you ought to get rid of me, but you haven't the guts to do it. So you came up here into the mountains to get your druids to work it by magic. All right, I'm going to ask them to help you." He laughed and let her go, giving her a slight impulse away from him. "Ask? You'll ask? Do you mean to tell me that you've said as much as one single solitary prayer on this island?" "Yes," he said casually, "I have." She scorned him. "Are you trying to tell me, Bobby, that you're doing this pilgrimage?" "I haven't fasted. I didn't know about that. And anyway, I probably won't. I've got my pockets stuffed with 2 pounds of the best chocolates I could buy in Bundoran. I don't suppose I'll even stay up all night like the rest of you. The place is so crowded that I don't suppose anybody'll notice me if I curl up in some corner of the boathouse. I heard somebody saying that people had to sleep there last night. But you never know. I might. I just might stay awake. If I do, It'll remind me of going to midnight mass with my father when I was a kid, or going to retreats when we used to all hold up a lighted candle and renounce the devil. It was a queer sensation standing there by the lake and saying those words all over again. Do you know, I thought I'd completely forgotten them. The next thing you're going to say is that you believe in the devil, you fraud. Oh, there's no trouble about believing in that, old gentleman. There isn't a doctor in the world who doesn't, though he'll give him another name. And on a wet night, in a place like this, you could believe in a lot of things. No, my girl, what I find it hard to believe in is the flesh and the world. They are good things. Do you think I'm ever going to believe that your body and my body are evil? And you don't either. And you're certainly never going to renounce the world because you are tied to it hand and foot. That's not true. His voice cut her like a whip. Then why do you go on living with your husband? She stammered feebly. He cut her again. You do it because he's rich and you like comfort and you like being a somebody. With a switch of her head, she brushed past him. She did not see him again that night. The night world turned imperceptibly. In the church, for hour after hour, the voices obstinately beat back the responses. She sank under the hum of the prayer wheel, the lust for sleep, her own despairs. Was he among the crowd, or asleep in a corner of the boat shed? She saw his flatly domed fingers, a surgeon's hand, so strong, so sensitive. She gasped at the sensual image she'd evoked. The moon touched a black window with colour. After an age it had stolen to another. Heads drooped. Neighbours poked one another awake with a smile. Many of them had risen from the benches in order to keep themselves awake and were circling the aisles in a loose procession of slurring feet, responding as they moved. Exhaustion began to work on her mind. Objects began to disconnect, became isolated, each within its own outline. Now it was the pulpit, now a statue, now a crucifix. Each object took on the vividness of a hallucination. The crucifix detached itself from the wall and leaned towards her, and for a long while she saw nothing but the heavy pendant body, the staring eyes, so that when the old man at her side let his head sink over on her shoulder and then woke up with a start, she felt him no more than if they were two fishes touching in the sea. Bit by bit, the incantations drew her in. Sounds came from her mouth. Prayers flowed between her and those troubled eyes that fixed hers. She swam into an ecstasy as rare as one of those perfect dances of her youth, when she used to swing in a whirl of music, a swirl of bodies, a circling of lights, floated out of her mortal frame, alone in the arms that embraced her. Suddenly it all exploded. One of the 4 respites of the night had halted the prayers. The masked pilgrims relaxed. She looked blearily about her, no longer disjunct. Her guts rumbled. She looked at the old man beside her. She smiled at him, and he at her. My poor old knees are crucified, he grinned. You should have the skirts, she grinned back. They were all going out to stretch in the cool and now dry air or to snatch a smoke. The amber windows of the church shivered in a pool of water. A hearty-voiced young woman leaning on the balustrade lit a match for her. The match hissed into the invisible lake lapping below. The old fag, said the young woman, dragging deep on a cigarette, is a great comfort. 'Tis as good as a man. I wonder, she said, what would St. Patrick think if he saw women smoking on his island? He'd beat the living lights out of the lot of us. She laughed aloud. She must tell him that. She began to wander through the dark crowds in search of him. He had said something that wasn't true, and she would answer him. She went through the crowds down to the boat slip. He was standing there, looking out into the dark, as if he hadn't stirred since she saw him there before midnight. For a moment she regarded him, frightened by the force of the love that gushed into her. Then she approached him. Well, Mr. Worldly Wise Man, enjoying your boathouse bed? I'm doing the vigil, he said smugly. You sound almighty pleased with yourself. He spoke eagerly now. Jenny, we mustn't quarrel. We must understand one another and understand this place. I'm just beginning to. An island in a remote lake among the mountains. Nighttime, no sleep, hunger, the conditions of the desert. I was right in what I said to you. Can't you see how the old hermits who used to live here could swim off into a trance in which nothing existed but themselves and their visions? I told you a man can renounce what he calls the devil, but not the flesh, not the world. They thought like you that they could throw away the flesh and the world, but they were using the flesh to achieve one of the rarest experiences in the world. Don't you see it? Experiences. The next thing you'll be talking about is symptoms. Well, surely you must have observed. He peered at the luminous dial of his watch. I should say that at about 4 o'clock we will probably begin to experience a definite sense of dissociation. After that, a positive alienation. She turned furiously from him. She came back to say, I would much prefer, Bobby, if you would have the decency to go away in the morning. I can find my own way home. I hope we don't meet again on this island. Or out of it. The magic working, he laughed. After that she made a deliberate effort of the mind to mean and to feel every separate word of the prayers, which is a great foolishness, since prayers are not poems to be read or even understood. They are an instinct. To dance would be as wise. She thought that if she could not feel what she said, how could she mean it? And so she tried to savour every word, and from trying to mean each word, lagged behind the rest, sank into herself, and ceased to pray. After the second respite, she prayed only to keep awake. As the first cold pallor of morning came into the windows, her heart rose again. But the eastern hills are high here, and the morning holds off stubbornly. It's the worst hour of the vigil, when the body ebbs, the prayers sink to a drone, and the night seems to have begun all over again. At the last respite she emerged to see pale tints of blue on the hills. The slow cumulus clouds cast a sheen on the water. There is no sound, no birds sing. At this hour the pilgrims are too awed or too exhausted to speak, so that the island reverts to its ancient silence in spite of the crowds. By the end of the last bout she was calm like the morning lake. She longed for the cup of black tea. She was unaware of her companions. She did not think of him. She was unaware of herself. She no more thought of God than a slave thinks of his master. And after she had drunk her tea, she sat in the morning sun outside the women's hostel, like an old blind woman who has nothing in life to wait for but sleep. The long day expired as dimly as the vapour rising from the water. The heat became morbid. One is said to be free on the second day to converse, to think, to write, to read, to do anything at all that one pleases, except the one thing everybody wants to do, to sleep. She did nothing but watch the clouds, or listen to the gentle muttering of the lake. Before noon she heard some departing pilgrims singing a hymn as the great ferryboats pushed off. She heard their voices without longing. She did not even desire food. When she met him, she was without rancour. "Still here?" she said, and when he nodded, "Sleepy?" "Sleepy. Too many chocolates, probably." "I didn't eat them. I took them out of my pockets one by one as I leaned over the balustrade, and guessed what centre each had. Coffee, marshmallow, nut, toffee, cream, and dropped it in with a little splash to the holy fishes. She looked up at him gravely. "Are you really trying to join this pilgrimage?" "Botching it. I'm behindhand with my rounds. I have to do 5 circuits between today and tomorrow. I may never get them done. Still, something's better than nothing." "You dear fool." If he had not walked away then, she would have had to. Such a gush of affection came over her at the thought of what he was doing, and why he was doing it. Stupidly, just like a man, skeptically, just like a man, not admitting it to himself, just like a man. For all sorts of damn fool rational reasons, just like a man, and not at all for the only reason that she knew was his real reason, because she was doing it, which meant that he loved her. She sat back and closed her eyes, and the tears of chagrin oozed between her lids. as she felt her womb stir with desire of him. When they met again, it was late afternoon. "Done 4 rounds," he said so cheerfully that he maddened her. "It's not golf, Bobby, damn you." "I should jolly well think not. I may tell you my feet are in such a condition that I won't be able to play golf for a week. Look." She didn't look. She took his arm and led him to the quietest corner she could find. "Bobby, I'm going to confess something to you. I've been thinking about it all day, trying to get it clear. I know now why I came here. I came because I know inside me that someday our apple will have to fall off the tree. I'm 40. You're nearly 50. It'll have to happen. I came here because I thought it right to admit that someday, if it has to be, I'm willing to give you up." He began to shake all over with laughter. "What the hell are you laughing at?" she moaned. "When women begin to reason, listen, wasn't there a chap sometime who said, 'Oh God, please make me chaste, but not just yet'? What I'm saying is now, if it has to be, if it can be, if I can make it be, I suppose," she said wildly. "I'm really asking for a miracle, that my husband would die, or that you'd die, or something like that would make it all come right." He burst into such a peal of laughter that she looked around her apprehensively. A few people near them also happened to be laughing over something and looked at them indulgently. "Do you realize, Bobby, that when I go to confession here, I'll have to tell all about us, and I'll have to promise to give you up?" "Yes, darling. And you won't mean a single word of it." "But I always mean it." He stared at her as if he was pushing curtains aside in her. "Always? Do you mean you've been saying it for 6 years?" I mean it when I say it, then I get weak. I can't help it, Bobby, you know that." She saw the contempt in his eyes and began to talk rapidly, twisting her marriage ring madly around her finger. He kept staring into her eyes like a man staring down the long perspective of a railway line, waiting for the engine to appear. "So you see why there wasn't any sense in asking me yesterday why I come now and not at some other time. Because with me, there isn't any other time. It's always now. I meet you now, and I love you now, and I think it's not right now, and then I think, no, not now, and then I say, I'll give you up now, and I mean it every time, until we meet again, and it begins all over again, and there's never any end to it until someday I can say, yes, I used to know him once, but not now, and then it will be a now where there won't be any other now anymore, because there'll be nothing to live for." The tears were leaking down her face. He sighed. "Dear me, you've got yourself into a mess, haven't you? Oh, God, the promises and the promises. I wish the world would end tonight and we'd both die together." He gave her his big damp handkerchief. She wiped her eyes and blew her nose and said, "You don't mean to go to confession, do you?" He chuckled sourly. "And promise. I must go and finish a round of pious golf. I'm afraid, old girl, you just want to get me into the same mess as yourself. No, thank you. You must solve your own problems in your own way, and I in mine." That was the last time she spoke to him that day. She went back to the balustrade where she'd smoked with the hearty girl in the early hours of the morning. She was there again. She wore a scarlet beret. She was smoking again. She began to talk, and the talk flowed from her mouth without stop. She had fine, broad shoulders, a big, mobile mouth, and a pair of wild goat's eyes. After a while it became clear that the woman was beside herself with terror. She suddenly let it all out in a gush of exhaled smoke. "Do you know why I'm hanging round here? 'Cause I ought to go into confession, and I'm in dread of it. He'll tear me alive, he'll murder me. It's not easy for a girl like me, I can promise you." "You must have terrible sins to tell," she smiled comfortingly. "He'll slaughter me, I'm telling you." "What is it? Boys?" The two goat's eyes dilated with fear and joy. Her hands shook like a drunkard's. "I can't keep away from them. I wish to God I never came here. But how silly. It's only a human thing. I'm sure half the people here have the same tale to tell. It's an old story, child. The priests are sick of hearing it. Oh, don't be talking. Leave me alone. I'm criminal, I tell you. And there are things you can't explain to a priest. My God, you can hardly explain them to a doctor." "You're married?" looking at her ring. Poor Tom, I have him wore out. He took me to a doctor one time to know if anything would cure me. The old fooler took me temperature and gave me a book like a bus guide about when it's safe and when it isn't safe to make love. The old idiot. I was pregnant again before Christmas. 6 years married and I have 6 kids. Nobody could stand that gait of going. And I'm only 24. Am I to have a baby every year of my life? I'd give me right hand this minute for a double whiskey. Look, you poor child, we're all in the same old ferryboat here. What about me? You? It's not men with me, it's worse. Worse, in God's name, what's worse than men? The girl looked all over her, followed her arm down to her hand, to her third finger. One man. The tawny eyes swiveled back to her face and immediately understood. Are you very fond of him? She asked gently, and taking the unspoken answer, said, still more pityingly, You can't give him up. It's 6 years now, and I haven't been able to give him up. The girl's eyes roved sadly over the lake, as if she were surveying a lake of human unhappiness. Then she threw her butt into the water, and her red beret disappeared into the moor of the church porch. She saw him twice before the dusk thickened and the day grew cold again with the early sunset. He was sitting directly opposite her before the men's hostel, smoking, staring at the ground between his legs. They sat facing one another. They were separated by their identities, joined by their love. She glimpsed him only once after that, at the hour when the sky and the hills merge, an outline passing across the lake. Soon after, she had permission to go to her cubicle. Immediately she lay down, she spiraled to the bottom of a deep lake of sleep. She awoke refreshed and unburdened. She had received the island's gift, its sense of remoteness from the world, almost a sensation of the world's death. It is the source of the island's kindness. Nobody is just matter, poor to be exploited by rich, weak to be exploited by the strong. In mutual generosity, each recognizes the other only as a form of soul. It is a brief, harsh utopia of equality in nakedness. The bare feet are a symbol of that nakedness unknown in the world they have left. The happiness to which she awoke was dimmed a little by a conversation she had with an Englishman over breakfast, the usual black tea and a piece of oaten bread. He was a city man who had arrived the day before, been up all night while she slept. He'd not yet shaved. He was about 62 or 3, small and tubby, his eyes perpetually wide and unfocusing behind pince-nez glasses. "That's right," he said, answering her question. "I'm from England, Liverpool. I cross by the night boat and get here the next afternoon. Quite convenient, really. I've come here every year for the last 22 years, apart from the war years. I come on account of my wife." "Is she ill?" "She died 22 years ago. No, it's not what you might think. I'm not praying for her. She was a good woman, but, well, you see, I wasn't very kind to her. I don't mean I quarrelled with her or drank or was unfaithful. I never gambled. I've never smoked in my life." His hands made a faint movement that was meant to express a whole life, all the confusion and trouble of his soul. "It's just that I wasn't kind. I didn't make her happy." "Isn't that," she said, to comfort him, "a very private feeling? I mean, it's not in the 10 Commandments that thou shalt make thy wife happy." He didn't smile. He made the same faint movement with his fingers. "Oh, I don't know. What's love if it doesn't do that? I mean to say, it's something godly to love another human being, isn't it? I mean, what does godly mean if it doesn't mean giving up everything for another? It isn't human to love, you know. It's foolish. It's a folly. A divine folly. It's beyond all reason, all limits. I didn't rise to it," he concluded sadly. She looked at him and thought, a little fat man, a clerk in some Liverpool office all his life, married to some mousy little woman, thinking about love as if he was some sort of Greek mystic. "It's often," she said lamely, "more difficult to love one's husband or one's wife, as the case may be, than to love one's neighbour." "Oh, much," he agreed without a smile. "Much, much more difficult." At which she was overcome by the thought that inside ourselves we have no room without a secret door, no solid self that has not a ghost inside it trying to escape. If I leave Bobby, I still have George. If I leave George, I still have myself, and whatever I find in myself. She patted the little man's hand and left him, fearing that if she let him talk on, even his one little piece of sincerity would prove to be a fantasy, and in the room that he had found behind his own room, she would open other doors leading to other obsessions. He told her something true about her own imperfection and about the nature of love, and she wanted to share it while it was still true. But she couldn't find him, and there was still one more circuit to do before the ferryboat left. She did meet Goat's Eyes. The girl clutched her with tears magnifying her yellow and green irises and gasped joyously. I found a lamb of a priest, a saint anointed. He was as gentle. What's your husband earning? Says he. £4.10 a week, father, says I. And 6 children, says he. You poor woman, says he. You don't need to come here at all. Your purgatory is at home. He laid all the blame on poor Tom, and God forgive me, I let him do it. Bring him here to me, says he, and I'll cool him for you. God bless the poor innocent priest. I wish I knew as little about marriage as he does. But, and here she broke into a wail, sure he has me ruined altogether now. He's after making me so fond of poor Tommy, I think I'll never get home soon enough to go to bed with him. And in a vast flood of tears of joy, of relief, and of fresh misery, I wish I was a bloomin' nun. It was not until they were all waiting at the ferryboat that she saw him. She managed to sit beside him in the boat. He touched her hand and winked. She smiled back at him. The bugler blew his bugle. A tardy traveller came racing out of the men's hostel. The boatload cheered him. The bugler helped him aboard with a joke about people who can't be persuaded to stop praying, and there was a general chaff about people who have a lot to pray about, and then somebody raised a parting hymn, and the rowers began to push the heavy oars, and singing they were slowly rowed across the summer lake back to the world. They were driving back out of the hills by the road they had come, both silent. At last she could hold in her question no longer. Did you go, Bobby? Meaning, had he, after all his years of silence, of rebellion, of disbelief, made his peace with God at the price of a compact against her? He replied gently, Did I probe your secrets all these years? She took the rebuke humbly, and for several miles they drove on in silence. They were close, their shoulders touched, but between them there stood that impenetrable wall of identity that segregates every human being in a private world of self. Feeling it, she realized at last that it is only in places like the Lake Island that the barriers of self break down. The tubby little clerk from Liverpool had been right. Only when love desires nothing but renunciation, total surrender, does self surpass self. Everybody who ever entered the island left the world of self behind for a few hours, exchanged it for what the little man had called divine folly. It was possible only for a few hours, unless one had the courage, or the folly, to renounce the world altogether. Then another thought came to her. In the world, there might also be escape from the world. Do you think, Bobby, that when people are in love, they can give up everything for one another? No, he said flatly, except perhaps in the first raptures. If I had a child, I think I could sacrifice anything for it, even my life. Yes, he agreed, it has been known to happen. And she looked at him sadly, knowing that they would never be able to marry, and even if she did, that she would never have children. And yet, if they could have married, there was a lake. Do you know what I'm planning at this moment? He asked breezily. She asked without interest what it was. Well, I'm simply planning the meal we're going to eat tonight in Galway at midnight. At midnight? Then we're going on with this pilgrimage. Are we? Don't you want to? It was your idea in the beginning. All right, and what are we going to do until midnight? I've never known time to be so long. I'm going to spend the day fishing behind Glencar. That will kill the hungry day. After that, until midnight, we'll take the longest possible road around Connemara. Then, would you have any objections to mountain trout cooked in milk, stuffed roast kid with fresh peas and spuds in their jackets, apple pie and whipped cream, and a cool pouilly fuissé, a cosy 1929 claret, west of Ireland, Pont l'Evêque, finishing up with Gaelic coffee and 2 otards. Much more in your line, if I know anything about you, than your silly old black tea and hot salt water. I admit I like the things of the flesh. You live for them. He had said it so gently, so affectionately, that half in dismay, half with amusement, she couldn't help remembering Goat's Eyes, racing home as fast as the bus would carry her to make love to her Tommy. After that they hardly spoke at all, and then only of casual things, such as a castle beside the road, the sun on the edging sea, a tinker's caravan, an opening view. It was early afternoon as they entered the deep valley at Glencar, and he probed in second gear for an attractive length of stream, found one, and started eagerly to put his rod together. He began to walk up against the dazzling bubble of water, and within an hour was out of sight. She stretched herself out on a rug on the bank and fell sound asleep. It was nearly 4 o'clock before she woke up, stiff and thirsty. She drank from a pool in the stream, and for an hour she sat alone by the pool, looking into its peat-brown depth, as vacantly contented as a tinker's wife to live for the moment, to let time wind and unwind everything. It was 5 o'clock before she saw him approaching, plodding in his flopping waders, with 4 trout on a rush stalk. He threw the fish at her feet, and himself beside them. "I nearly ate them raw," he said. "Let's cook them and eat them," she said fiercely. He looked at her for a moment, then got up and began to gather dry twigs, found Monday's newspaper in the car, it looked like a paper of years ago, and started the fire. She watched while he fed it. When it was big enough in its fall to have made a hot bed of embers, he roasted 2 of the trout across the hook of his gaff, and she smelled the crisping flesh and sighed. At last he laid them, browned and crackly, on the grass by her hand. She took one by its crusted tail, smelt it, looked at him, and slung it furiously into the heart of the fire. He gave a sniff laugh, and did the same with his. "Copycat," she said. "Let's get the hell out of here," he said, jumping up. "Carry the kit, will you?" She rose, collected the gear, and followed him, saying, "I feel like an Arab wife. Carry the pack, go here, go there." They climbed out of the glens onto the flat moorland of the Easkey Peninsula, while the evening light was a cold ochre, gleaming against green bogland that was streaked with all the weedy colours of the strand at ebb. At Ballina she suggested that they should have tea. "It'll be a pleasant change of diet," he said. When they had found a cafe and she was ordering the tea, he said to the waitress, "And bring lots of hot buttered toast." "This," she said, as she poured out the tea and held up the milk jug questioningly, "is a new technique of seduction. Milk? Are you having milk?" "No." "No, then. Some nice hot buttered toast?" "Are you having toast?" he demanded. "Why the bloody hell should it be up to me to decide?" "I asked you a polite question," he said rudely. "No." "No." They looked at one another as they sipped the black tea like 2 people who were falling head over heels into hatred of one another. "Could you possibly tell me," he said presently, "why I bother my head with a fool of a woman like you?" "I can only suppose, Bobby, that it is because we are in love with one another." "I can only suppose so," he growled. "Let's get on." They took the longest way round he could find on the map, west into County Mayo, across between the lakes at Pontoon, over the level bogland to Castlebar. Here the mountains walled in the bogland plain with cobalt air. In the fading light the land was losing all solidity. Clouds like soap suds rose and rose over the edges of the mountains until they glowed as if there were a fire of embers behind the blue ranges. In Castlebar he pulled up by the post office and telephoned to the hotel at Salt Hill for dinner and 2 rooms. When he came out he saw a poster in the shop window and said, "Why don't we go to the pictures? It'll kill a couple of hours." "By rights," she said, "you ought to be driving me home to Dublin." "If you wish me to, I will." "Would you, if I asked you?" "Do you want me to?" "I suppose it is rather late now, isn't it?" "Not at all. Fast going. We could be there about 1 o'clock. Shall we?" "It wouldn't help. George is away. I'd have to bring you in and give you something to eat and—" "Let's go to the blasted movies." The film was Charlie's Aunt. They watched it slapstick gloomily. When they came out, after 9 o'clock, there was still a vestigial light in the sky. They drove on and on, westward, still prolonging the light, prolonging the drive, holding off the night's decision. Before Killarry they paused at a black-faced lake, got out, and stood beside its quarried beauty. Nothing along its stony beach but a few wind-torn rushes. "I could eat you," he said. She replied that only lovers and cannibals talk like that. They dawdled past the long fjord of Killarry, where young people on holiday sat outside the hotel, their drinks on the trestled tables. In Clifton, the street was empty, people already climbing to bed, as the lights in the upper windows showed. They branched off along the long coastal road where the sparse whitewashed cottages were whiter than the foam of waves that barely suggested sea. At another, darker strand, they halted. But now they saw no foam at all and divined the sea only by its invisible whispering, or when a star touched a wave. Midnight was now only an hour away. Their headlights sent rocks and rabbits into movement. The heather streamed past them like kangaroos. It was well past 11 as they poured along the lonely land by Galway Bay. Neither of them had spoken for an hour. As they drove into Salthill, there was nobody abroad. Galway was dark. Only the porch light of the hotel showed that it was alive. When he turned off the engine, the only sound at first was the crinkle of contracting metal as the engine began to cool. Then, to their right, they heard the lisping bay. The panel button lit the dashboard clock. 1:45, he said, leaning back. She neither spoke nor stirred. "Jenny," he said sharply. She turned her head slowly, and by the dashboard light he saw her white smile. "Yes, darling?" "Worn out?" he asked, and patted her knee. She vibrated her whole body so that the seat shook, and stretched her arms about her head, and lowering them, let her head fall on his shoulder, and sighed happily and said, "What I want is a good long drink of anything on earth, except tea." These homing 12-o'clockers from Loch Gerrig are well known in every hotel all over the west of Ireland. Revelry is the reward of penance. The porter welcomed them as if they were heroes returned from a war. As he led them to their rooms, he praised them, he sympathized with them, he patted them up and he patted them down. He assured them that the ritual grill was at that moment sizzling over the fire. He proffered them hot baths, and he told them where to discover the bar. "You'll discover it," was his phrase. The wording was exact, for the bar's gaiety was muffled by dim lighting, drawn blinds, locked doors. In the overheated room, he took off his jacket and unloosed his tie. They had to win a corner of the counter, and his order was for 2 highballs with ice in them. Within 2 minutes, they were at home with the crowd. The island might never have existed if the barmaid, who knew where they'd come from, had not laughed. "I suppose you'll eat like lions." After supper, they relished the bar once more, sipping slowly now, so refreshed that they could have started on the road again without distaste or regret. As they sipped, they gradually became aware of a soft strumming and drumming near at hand, and were told that there was a dance on in the hotel next door. He raised his eyebrows to her. She laughed and nodded. They gave it up at 3 o'clock and walked out into the warm cool of the early summer morning. Gently tipsy, gently tired, they walked to the little promenade. They leaned on the railing, and he put his arm about her waist, and she put hers around his, and they gazed at the moon silently raking its path across the sea towards Arran. They had come, she knew, to the decisive moment. He said, "They have a fine night for it tonight on the island." "A better night than we had," she said tremulously. After another spell of wave-fall and silence, he said, "Do you know what I'm thinking, Jenny? I'm thinking that I wouldn't mind going back there again next year. Maybe I might do it properly the next time." "The next time," she whispered, and all her body began to dissolve, and closing her eyes she leaned against him. He too closed his eyes, and all his body became as rigid as a steel girder that flutters in a storm. Slowly they opened their love-drunk eyes and stood looking long over the brightness and blackness of the sea. Then gently, ever so gently, with a gentleness that terrified her, he said, "Shall we go in, my sweet?" She didn't stir. She didn't speak. Slowly turning to him, she lifted her eyes to him pleadingly. "No, Bobby, please. Not yet. Not yet. Not tonight." He looked down at her and drew his arms about her. They kissed passionately. She knew what that kiss implied. Their mouths parted. Hand in hand, they walked slowly back to the hotel, to their separate rooms. So that was The Lovers of the Lake by Seán Faoláin. This is going to be the quickest ever commentary because I've got to rush out. I've got a great thing tonight. I'm interviewing Peter James, the king of crime, a really big crime writer, and I've got to be somewhere earlier than I thought, and I'm not even dressed. So I need just to do this really quickly. Seán Faoláin was born John Francis Whelan in Cork in Ireland in 1900, and he emerged as one of the most influential figures in the 20th century Irish literature and cultural criticism. He was raised in a pious Catholic family. You may have got that. Faoláin's early life was marked by his immersion in the Gaelic revival, so he learned Irish, changed his name back to what would have been the Irish form of John Whelan, and he was educated at University College Cork and later at Harvard University. His literary career spanned several decades and encompassed multiple genres, including short stories, novels, biographies and critical essays. His editorship of the Bell magazine from 1940 to 45 was particularly significant, providing a platform for diverse voices and perspectives in post-independence Ireland. I don't know if he said, yeah, he was in the Irish War of Independence. I think I said that. Throughout his career, Faoláin grappled with the complexities of Irish identity, the legacy of the revolution and the role of Catholicism in Irish society. His work often challenged prevailing narratives and pushed for a more nuanced understanding of Irish culture and history. Despite facing censorship early in his career, they said his work was indecent. Faoláin went on to receive numerous accolades, including honorary degrees from Trinity College Dublin and the National University of Ireland, cementing his status as a key figure in Irish letters. Lovers of the Lake was first published in 1957 as part of his collection, The Finest Short Stories of Seán Faoláin. The collection was published by Little Brown and Company in Boston and represented a selection of what Faoláin considered his best work. Lovers of the Lake quickly became one of Faoláin's most widely anthologized and critically discussed stories. It has since appeared in numerous other collections and anthologies of Irish literature, including the collected stories of Seán Faoláin. 1980, published by Constable in London. The notes always say who published them. The story's exploration of the tension between religious devotion and physical desire, set against the backdrop of a traditional Irish pilgrimage, has made it a significant text in discussions of mid-20th century Irish literature and cultural identity. So the first thing to say is, some of you may be thinking, what is an Englishman reading this story? Well, so I do have some ties with Ireland. Whose wasn't, but my grandfather was Irish, and I spent some time over in the Gaeltacht in Carrarua learning Irish. So anyway, but the wider point is this: if you say that I can't read as an Englishman, I can't read Irish stories, then can I read Russian stories? Can I read Korean stories? Can I read stories written by a woman? And I think the important thing of this is this is not narrow literature. This is literature that speaks to humanity. So call me old-fashioned, but I think that this story is a story written by an Irishman, set in Ireland, but it is for the whole world. Okay, so there we are. That's my defence of that. You may have your own opinions. Okay, so what do I think it's about? Well, I think it's really interesting. I don't know if you've ever been married and been in love with somebody who was also married, but to somebody else. And the two of you were in love with each other, but it wasn't going to be. It wasn't going to happen. So that's what this is about. And she says she can't give him up. Jenny says she can't give him up. So I think it's a story of two parts. First of all, we have this very traditional male. You know, the traditional male doesn't talk about his feelings. He doesn't talk about love. He demonstrates his feelings through his actions. That's the important thing. And that is what traditional males do. They don't go all lovey-dovey. They can deflect that, in fact, but they do things which indicate. So I think that's important because this is what he does. So the first part is her. She is a good Catholic girl, and she knows that adultery is wrong. And even if there's been no physical contact, And that might be why they went to their separate beds at the end, because he was playing to his audience who would have... I mean, if there'd been potentially actual physical contact, it's unclear in 1957 if that would have ever seen the light of day in Ireland or would have piled bricks on his head. But there may be other reasons why they go to separate beds as well. So she's a parasite, and she is struggling with what she knows to be a sin. And she talks about, I think very humanly, about... she wants to give him up now, and then she sees him, and then that's now, and then she thinks, I'm going to give him up, and then it all starts all over again, because you can't tell your heart what to do. Your heart does what it wants to do, and you may just be hanging on like a fairground Big Dipper ride, but you can't make yourself love somebody, and you can't stop yourself loving somebody. The best you can do is go away from them and never see them again, and that will quieten it, but it may not kill it. So that's her. And so she goes to confess her sins. And she sees the goat-eyed girl, who is a kind of like a ramped-up version of herself, who's a bit randier, as we may say, than she is, and has perhaps been more physical about acting out her desires for the boys. But our woman, there's no hint that it's ever been consummated. I think it's possible that it has after 6 years, but you don't know. They touch each other. So I know that doesn't indicate everything, but if you touch each other after 6 years, man, maybe it means it's gone a little bit further. But that it did to me anyway. I presumed that they had. So she doesn't love her husband. He points out very pointedly, and this is a very male perspective. We saw it in Stefan Zweig's story as well, Forgotten Memories, about, this male perspective that women who love you don't go with you because they're with a rich man. And this is a very common male view that, look at her, she's just after the money, and she's not true. And I think that's what he's levelling at her. But he demonstrates his love for her by going through the rigours and ordeals of the it's not Croagh-Patrick, it's Loch Jarrig, a penitence pilgrimage, even though he doesn't believe. So he's doing it for her, and she knows that. And that, as she comes around, and they're a bit cross with each other, but that demonstrates his love for her. So her world is the pilgrimage. That's her dealing with it. His world is the bit after, where they go into nature. He goes fishing. There's something wrong with the trout. I didn't quite work that out. They have this lovely time. They go drinking. They go dancing. And they have this worldly love. And they both enjoy it. And so you think in the first bit, she is going to give him up. And then in the second bit, you think, no, she's not. She's going to give her husband up. Because she's got to do one or the other, hasn't she? Or has she? Or can she just live in the now? Unsatisfactory, you would have said. But I think it's at least a possibility, because at the end they go to their separate beds, and we may say that that might be because of and it might be for both of these reasons, the cultural reception that would have got in Ireland at that time, to boldly proclaim physical adultery. But it might also be because they are living in the now. So she talks about now. Now is the only time you can live. And so they've lived in the now, fishing, watching the beach. I remember loads of phosphorescence in Galway Bay. All the waves were alive with lights, of these creatures. I was there at Easter, but it was a warm Easter. And anyway, so it's now. And going to their separate beds suggests to me that's as far as they get, that they still live in the now and nothing is decided one way or the other. She doesn't leave her husband for him, and she doesn't give him up. So that's my quick, rapid through. I've got to go and get shaved, washed, have something to eat. Anyway, I'm very excited by this opportunity because Peter James is a massive name. Okay, I'll probably let you know how that went, probably on the Detective Channel. Hope you're all well. Bye-bye.